For as long as we've been able to ask the big questions, one has always stood out: the God question. Is this incredible inquiry that sits right at the intersection of religion and philosophy, a puzzle that some of the greatest minds in history have spent their entire lives trying to solve. All right, let's dive in. Here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at why this question is so central to so much of Western thought. Then, we'll get into how you even begin to define God. From there, we'll explore the search for proof, the powerful challenge that atheism presents, and finally, a really fascinating response that has to do with the very nature of belief itself. So, for many of history's most important thinkers, God wasn't just, a matter of personal faith. Not even close. For them, the concept of God was actually a logical necessity. It was the absolute pillar holding their entire philosophical worlds together. And what's really fascinating is just how critical this idea was. Look at this list. For Aristotle, God was the prime mover, the thing that started everything. For Descartes, God was the literal foundation of certainty, the only reason he could trust his own thoughts. For Spinoza, God was reality, what he called substance. The point the source makes is crystal clear. If you try to pull the idea of God out of these philosophical systems, the entire structure just crumbles. Okay, so if God is this central, crucial piece of the puzzle, how in the world do you even begin to describe such a being? Well, it turns out that religion and philosophy take surprisingly different roads to get there. And this slide just lays out that difference perfectly. The religious approach tends to use what are called positive or subutini attributes. These come from sacred texts and describe what God is: all-knowing, all-seeing, all-hearing. But then you have philosophy, which often prefers to go the other way, using negative or selby attributes. It describes what God is not created, not changing, not made of parts. Which, leads to a really good question. Why would philosophers shy away from that? What's so risky about saying God is all-seeing? It seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, they were worried about this one big word: anthropomorphism. See, the moment you say God sees, you're running the risk of suggesting God has eyes. If you say God hears, you might be implying ears. Philosophers were terrified that this would shrink a limitless, transcendent concept down to just a superpowered human, trapping the divine in our own very human limitations. So once these thinkers had their definitions sorted out, the next step was pretty obvious. Let's set aside revelation for a minute. Can we use pure, cold, hard reason and logic to actually prove that a being with these attributes exists? And this led to this whole amazing toolkit of logical arguments that you find in both Islamic and Western philosophy. You've got the cosmological argument, the big "why is there something instead of nothing" question. There's the teleological argument, which looks at the incredible design and order in the universe, like an eyeball or a galaxy, and says, hey, that must have a designer. And there are others too, like the moral argument, that say our deep, shared sense of right and wrong has to come from a divine source. All of these were attempts to build a solid, logical bridge from the world we can see to a divine reality we can't. But as with any big idea, for every argument, there's a counterargument. And these rational proofs eventually ran headfirst into a really powerful challenge. One that didn't just question the logic, but asked a much, much simpler question. The philosopher Bertrand Russell, he just captured the heart of this challenge perfectly. Someone asked him what he'd say if he died and found himself standing before God. His response was this devastatingly simple critique. My lord, you did not give me anywhere near enough evidence. Basically, the proof just wasn't good enough. At its core, the position is this: if an all-powerful, all-wise being actually exists and wants us to believe, why make it so complicated? Why rely on ancient texts and tricky philosophical arguments? Why wouldn't the evidence be direct, clear, and just completely undeniable? So, how do you even respond to a challenge that powerful and that direct? Well, the source text gives a really incredible answer that completely flips the whole debate on its head. It moves the conversation away from looking for scientific-style proof and instead focuses on the meaning of faith itself. And here is the crucial counter-argument. Just think about it. If God's existence were as obvious as the chair you're sitting on, belief would be totally meaningless. You wouldn't choose to believe. You'd be forced to accept a fact. This argument says that a scenario like that would completely destroy human free will, which is seen as the very foundation of what makes faith, or iman, meaningful in the first place. So this reframes the whole purpose of those philosophical arguments we were talking about. They aren't supposed to be a weapon to force a skeptic to believe. Instead, their job is to give a rational, coherent foundation to someone who has already made the choice to believe.
They're there to bring intellectual comfort and stability to that faith.
And then the text leaves us with this beautiful, really poetic analogy to think on. What if the problem isn't that there's no evidence? What if the evidence is so bright, so overwhelming, that we can't look at it directly? Kind of like trying to stare straight into the sun. And that leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to mull over. Is the search for God really about finding some hidden clue in the dark? Or could it be about learning how to adjust our eyes to see a light that's so bright and so everywhere that we don't even notice it's there?